Thank you all for joining us for today's common grammar mistakes and how to avoid them workshop. Joining us today is Sarah Tajali from the Writing Center. So I'm just going to hand it over to her to get us started. Thank you.
All right, hi everybody, my name is Sarah. And like Navina said, we're going to go over some common grammar mistakes. These are just a few of the things that we've noticed. We see a lot of grad students at the Writing Center, and these are some of the things that we've pulled out. Common errors that we see. This obviously isn't an exhaustive list, but I'll give you a little overview of what we're going to talk about today. So some of the issues that we see are common verb tenses. They're, subject verb agreements. We'll also talk about some of the expectations of tenses that are in academic writing. We'll also talk about parallel structure, clauses, sentence fragments, comma splices, things like that. We'll also discuss pronoun referent confusion and some punctuations, and some punctuation marks that, we see a lot of errors with as well. And it'll just be more of a refresher for everybody too. And in the end, we'll do a little practice together. If you guys have any questions, just, you can speak up or put it in the chat, and I'll try my best to answer them as we go along. And in the end, we'll do some practice together. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the 3 most common verb tenses in academic writing. So first, we'll talk about simple present. And obviously, you should all be familiar. We use the present tense in the present moment. And we're also talking about habits or traits or qualities. So you want to use the present tense in those situations. The simple past is a definite moment in the past, and then the present perfect is an indefinite moment. So that's something that started in the past and is still true. So for example, they have researched, we would use like they have researched this topic for 10 years. So they began this in the past and it's still present. So these are the 3 most common tenses used in academic writing. It's not, like I said, an exhaustive list, but these are the most definitive ones. You also want to refer to your specific formatting guide. For example, APA wants you to use present tense for implications or current conclusions. Use the simple past for procedures or literature reviews, and then the simple past tense when describing results. And this is specific to APA. MLA has different guidelines. I know in certain types of text, if you're speaking about literature, they want you to use the present tense because it's considered a living document and it's still relevant in the present. So it's always a good idea to refer to your specific formatting guides, but these are the 3 most common verb tenses in most academic writing. Now we'll talk a little bit about the errors that we see. So when we try to sound academic and when we're writing in what we feel is a formal manner, there tends to be an overuse of the present perfect tense when the simple past will do. So for example, they've gone to the store yesterday. This is a one-time thing. So it's not that they went to the store yesterday and they haven't come back. They just went to the store. So you want to make sure to use the simple past in situations like this. And again, we don't speak this way. We don't technically go, they have gone. We'll say they've done this, they've done that. We use the contraction a lot when we use the present perfect. So sometimes we don't recognize it when we're using it in text. All right. Using the past tense when the present tense is needed. So for example, female GTAs experience disproportionate amounts of gaslighting. Unfortunately, this is still true. It's a sad, simple fact. So you want to use the present tense. Female GTAs experience disproportionate amounts of gaslighting. Hopefully that will soon be in the past tense. And then unnecessary shifts in tense. So researchers collected multiple samples and run them through the centrifuge. Here we start with the past tense and we shift to the present tense when this is something that happened in the past. So you want to maintain that consistency in your tense. Researchers collected multiple samples and ran them through the centrifuge. You're talking about something that happened in the past. Both of these actions happened in the past, so you want to keep those shifts consistent. Okay. Another common mistake that we see is when there's a bit of confusion in identifying whether a subject is plural or whether it's singular. So literature encompasses a lot, but it is just a subject. It's a singular subject. So when you're speaking about it, you want to use the singular verb voice, the person. So literature is an interesting subject, and for plural, you want to make sure you're using the plural tense. 2/3 of students are commuters. So students are the subject in the second example, literature is the first. So we'll go over some more examples of where the subject might be a little bit confusing. Okay, so when a prepositional phrase comes between the subject and the verb, that's where there tend to be some errors that occur. So the analysis of the results reveal a significant difference between the groups. Sometimes when we're writing really fast, we want to associate results as being the subject when actually it's just describing the analysis. The analysis is our subject. So the analysis reveals. And if you're ever confused about this, just take out those adjective phrases or adverb phrases that describe the noun or the verb to make sure, the noun or the verb to make sure that your subject and your verb agree. So the analysis is the subject, not the results. All right, any questions so far? Okay. And like I said, at the end, we'll do a little practice together.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So I always feel like I have to mix the past tense and present tense when I'm using a methodology, which is just a methodology, so it's a fact, right? So it should be present tense. And then I'm using that methodology to describe what I did in my research. So that's past tense. So I'm stringing those two in a sentence. That should be perfectly fine, right?
Sometimes shifts in tense are okay, just as long as it makes sense. So in this example that I had in the previous slide, it wouldn't make sense to say I did this. Those are kind of like back-to-back actions that both happened in the past. Now with your methodology, if you're saying I did this, if part of it is in the past, maybe the way that you collected your data, and then is going to be in the past tense, and then you might have some present tense going if you talk about like what you're doing to analyze that collection of data. So that's fine. Sometimes it's necessary to do that shift in tense, but you just want to make sure that it makes sense to your reader, right?
Do you advise trying to split those cases just to maintain consistency in one sentence?
I mean, I don't, it's so contextual, so it's really hard to say. I'd have to see it, to see whether it's okay or not. You just have to ask yourself if the order of events would make sense to the reader. Usually when we see these, it's just mostly error. So somebody will just make an unnecessary shift where they'll jump back and forth between the present tense and the past tense. For example, telling a story in the past, and they don't maintain that consistency. So it's confusing to the reader what the order of events is. So if you think the order of events makes sense, even if it's within one sentence that shows like a progression of time, it should be okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is parallel structure. And this is something that generally comes naturally to us when we're speaking. we use parallel structure to, it's a consistent pattern of words. So the way that we present the ideas, examples, or parts of a list, it helps us process it better as readers and as listeners when there is that consistency and that parallelism in structure. So this is totally intelligible sentence. Before the barbecue, you should buy some steaks, have prepared a marinade, wrap the potatoes in foil, and ignite the charcoal. We have a few different types of verbs here. And though it sounds fine, though it's intelligible, it's easier for our brain to process it if we have that parallelism. So you should buy steaks, prepare a marinade, wrap the potatoes, and ignite the charcoal. So this sort of parallelism helps your reader, like I said, digest your information a little bit better. And it's also for your listeners too. I think most of us, especially if you're a native speaker, this is just intuitive for you. And we don't realize that when we write, we don't do this, we don't insert this parallelism as often. So this is something to be aware of, especially when you have a list of items. All right, so next we're going to move on to independent and dependent clauses. And this is going to help us discuss punctuation a little bit more too. So an independent clause is a full sentence. It contains a subject and a verb, and it's a complete thought. So it can stand alone, hence the name independent. A dependent clause also contains a subject and a verb, but it's an incomplete thought or idea. So it cannot stand alone. So just like these bicycles, you can't ride tandem with just one person. So dependent clause needs an independent clause in order to make sense and in order to be a complete thought. All right, so let's take a look at this first independent clause. We studied the effect of cell phones on romantic relationships. That is a full thought. But just by adding one word, we can make an independent clause dependent. So when we studied the effects of cell phones on romantic relationships, okay? When you did that, what happened, right? So I think sometimes we'll put a period somewhere where it doesn't belong. It makes sense in our head, and we make these independent clauses dependent by adding words just like when or because in the wrong place. So as you can see, when we studied the effects of cell phones on romantic relationships, we looked at the work of Garcia and Midland. So we have added this dependent clause to an independent clause, which is we looked at the work of Garcia and Midland. So now we have a full thought. Below is the same sentence, just flipped. We looked at the work of Garcia and Midland when we studied the effects of cell phones on romantic relationships. So just a little punctuation tip too. If the dependent clause comes first, you're going to have a comma after it before you introduce the independent clause. But in the second example, the independent clause is coming first, so there's no comma needed. There we go. Okay, next is a fragment, an incomplete sentence lacking either a subject or a verb, or a dependent clause without an independent clause. So because the results were inconclusive. Okay, great. And what does that mean? We don't know because it's just a fragment of a sentence. And sometimes when we're looking at a whole paragraph of text and we're reading through, we don't see these as often because we see these fragments within the context of the entire paragraph. So sometimes they're a little bit harder to identify. So you want to make sure that these fragments are connected to an independent clause to make it a complete thought. The experiment was halted because the results were inconclusive. So there we have a complete thought. There's a subject, there's a verb, and we have the results. Okay, and then here's just another example of putting the dependent clause first. All right, And then fragments can also be caused by a misplaced period, which I said before. When you're looking at a giant block of text, again, you just don't notice this because when you're reading it quickly or proofreading it quickly, you might just miss, what this punctuation mark is doing to, slow the reader down or stopping them up a little bit. So our lab published 5 papers this year, which made this our most productive year ever. You want to connect those 2 sentences, and you could simply just do it with a comma. Any questions on that? Okay. All right. So pronoun referent confusion. This is just an example of who is this information referring to. So let's take a look at this sentence. Anna told Megan that she likes her new bike. Who is the her in this sentence? Is it Anna or is it Megan? It's not exactly clear. So you want to make sure that you clarify this information for your reader. Anna told Megan that she likes Megan's new bike. Anna told Megan that she likes Anna's new bike. Sometimes we need to have the proper noun in there because the pronoun doesn't give us enough information. We're not sure who it's referring to. All right. In Hollywood, they don't know about the American public. They don't know what the American public really wants to see. So who is the they referring to? It's unclear. You don't know if they're talking about just the citizens of Hollywood or any random person, but most likely they're talking about producers or filmmakers or screenwriters. It could be anybody in the Hollywood industry, but here it's not clear. So you want to make sure that if you use a pronoun, it's clear to the reader exactly who it's referring to. Okay. Another thing that could be confusing for your readers is introducing the pronoun before you introduce the subject that it's referring to or the proper noun that it's referring to. And I see this a lot. So the story examines their chance encounter and developing friendship. At this point, I'm totally confused. I don't know who there is because it's not until the next sentence that I'm learning that it's talking about the story of Pedro and Janice. So you want to make sure that if you are using these pronouns, they're coming after the first mention of these proper nouns or these nouns that you're referring them to. And a good idea too is to also make sure that if you're starting a new paragraph, don't, in your topic sentence or in the beginning of the paragraph, don't use pronouns to refer to something that you mentioned in the previous paragraph. Just reintroduce the name or the topic or whatever it is that you're talking to, because like when a reader goes on to the next paragraph, they're expecting a new topic. So it can throw somebody off to just see a pronoun where they don't know what it's referring to, and then they have to backtrack in your writing and try and figure it all out again. So just make sure that who the pronouns are referring to and that it's clear to your reader. Any questions on that? Okay. All right. So punctuation. So we're just going to go through this pretty quickly. Punctuation is like traffic signs. Some of them are mandatory, some of them are optional. So some can add clarity, some people need to have for the construction to make your words intelligible. And then some can substitute for others. We'll talk about some of those later, whether you can substitute a comma for a colon or a semicolon, parentheses, ndash, things like that.
Sarah, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So when we're talking about pronouns in your previous slide, I know that it's confusing to start a new paragraph for pronouns, but how many sentences would you say within the same paragraph that you can continue or that you can use the pronoun? So maybe like within the third, fourth.
I think it just depends on how much information you have in between the first mention. I mean, if you're talking about the same topic throughout the entire paragraph, I don't see why you couldn't use pronouns throughout. Sometimes it's just nice for your reader to switch it up, right? That's why we have pronouns. So we're not constantly saying like, you know, Mike, 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 or Smith, Smith, Smith throughout the entire paragraph. So it's just a matter of if the clarity still remains and, you know, just trying to give a little style to your writing so that it's not, so you have a little bit of variety to it too. It's all it's all contextual. I know I'm going to say that a lot. It all depends on the context of the writing, but just as long as it's clear who the pronouns are referring to. I mean, I've seen papers that, you know, they're just about one subject, one piece of writing, and I've seen writers use just the same pronoun. They don't reintroduce it. And in those cases, it's fine because they're talking about one author or one subject. So it just varies on the contents of the paragraph and, you know, how long between the first mention and the second mention. Is that a little bit clearer?
Yes, yes, it does. Thank you.
No problem. All right, so comma splices are the first thing we'll talk about. I'm sure you guys have heard this a bunch. Comma splice is just when you put a comma where a period should be. So this is splitting two independent clauses, two full sentences with a comma. Many graduate students frequent the Writing Center. Full thought, full idea. This helps them with their writing. Full thought, full idea, but they're separated by a comma, so that results in a punctuation error. So there's many ways we can fix this. First, just swap out the punctuation, a comma for a period. The next, you can add a modifier, which helps them with their writing, or you can use a semicolon. And semicolon, we use those to separate two independent clauses that are related. So you don't want to just put a semicolon between two sentences that aren't closely related. This is things that, you know, are within the same wheelhouse. Another thing you can do is add a coordinating conjunction. I'm not sure if you all have heard of the acronym FANBOYS, but it stands for and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. And fanboys are our coordinating conjunctions that we use to separate two independent clauses. So you can see here, the professor instructed the students to read the next chapter, but the students ignored him. So we're connecting two independent clauses with this conjunction. And you're going to want to use a comma with these coordinating conjunctions.
I
Yes.
have a question about that, Sarah.
Sure.
I mean, I feel that I overuse the conjunction sometimes, and I don't know, you know, how professional that looks in writing. But I just want to get your opinion on that.
So the conjunctions are used to show the relationship between the two ideas, right? So it just depends on what you're trying to convey. I don't necessarily think it's bad. You're just showing, like, the but shows here, you know, but the students ignored him. So it's showing the relationship between what the professor did and what the students did. In the next example, the bears did not seem interested in hikers, nor did they get out of the water. So it's showing the relationship between the ideas. So that's the function of the conjunction. I don't think it's unprofessional to use them too much if it helps. Like I said, if you want to add variety to your writing, you can cut those out, but it just all depends on the meaning that you're trying to convey. And I see a question about gender neutral pronouns. I use the plural verb with them. I think that the conventions might be different. So I know APA just added to their new, the newest edition, gender neutral pronouns are now accepted within APA, but I don't think there's any conventions for the verbs. I use them. I think it's just a matter of the person. So I think, I think that it sounds better to my brain, so I use the plural with them. But again, it's contextual too.
So going kind of not in the same comment that you just provided, but what about so? When you connect sentences with so, I always have this idea that, going back to what I stated before, professional, unprofessional, I feel like so becomes somewhat unprofessional.
I think it just depends on the context in which you use it. With so, we have so many different what's it called, synonyms for it. It just depends on what you're trying to convey with that so. As a result, I think with so we tend to overuse it a little bit because we use it so much in our day-to-day speech. So as a coordinating conjunction, I think it's fine if you're using it as an adjective to emphasize, just like the word just. I find myself putting that into my writing a lot, and when I go back to proofread, I have to take it out because it's just a filler word that we use all the time when we're speaking. So it's so easy to insert, see, I said so again, to insert so and just into your writing. So as a coordinating conjunction, I think it's fine if it's serving the purpose of what it means. But if you're using it as a modifier, like an adjective or adverb, an adverb, then I would try and remove it in those cases. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay. In speech, sometimes we would pause after so, and that it's a comma after so. It is appropriate. So we'll actually talk about lead-ins in just a second as we talk about commas. It's our next thing. So introductory elements is when we also use commas. For example, C, comma, the answer is not that complicated. So to answer your question, G, you can use so, comma, blah, 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 blah. And so in this instance would be kind of like therefore, as Sapir put in the comments. So we use commas to set off introductory materials. It could be a single word like see or so or therefore, but it also could be a phrase or a dependent clause, which we've already covered. Okay, and we also use commas to separate items in a series, especially if there's 3 or more. You want to include the comma before the conjunction as well. Some people don't, it's called the Oxford comma. When you have a comma before the conjunction with the and, students must register for classes, move into the dorms, and buy their books before the semester begins. So stylistically, some people don't like that and before, especially if you're in journalism. You want to cut down on punctuation or spaces or things like that. So AP style, I think, discourages the Oxford comma, but I think personally for me and others, writing formats like APA and MLA, they encourage the Oxford comma because it does add to clarity. So if we look at this second example, Jane enjoys cooking, her family, and her dog. If we were missing that second comma, some people could read it as Jane enjoys cooking, her family, and her dog. So she's actually cooking her family and her dog, as opposed to like enjoying 3 separate things. And I know that that's a stretch, but it does add to clarity when you have that Oxford comma. So I encourage it, but again, refer back to your individual formatting styles that you use for your different subjects. Like I said, AP discourages it, but other ones, I think it helps with clarity. Okay, any questions on commas? All right. So next we have semicolons. And like I said before, semicolons are used to separate independent clauses. Here we have, and independent clauses that are related and are not necessarily joined by a conjunction. So actually, that are not joined by a conjunction. So these two sentences below, Louise Erdrich is Ojibwe and German descent. Full thought, she writes about both heritages in her novels. So these two independent clauses are related, so we can separate them by a semicolon. All right, and if we use semicolons to separate independent clauses, if they're linked with a conjunctive adverb as well, or a transitional expression. So a conjunctive adverb, you don't have to know all these terms, but it's things like however, therefore, nevertheless. As you can see here, there is a semicolon before the however, and then followed by a comma. So that's another way in which we connect these two independent clauses with a semicolon. Okay. And then this again, like we talked about when we first started introducing punctuation, some things are optional, some things are mandatory. This is an example of an optional way of using a semicolon. And that's when there's items in a series that have commas within them, you can also use semicolons to separate these ideas for clarity. Again, this is optional, but for me personally, I think it is easier for my brain to kind of separate all these ideas. So as we can see here, classic science fiction sagas are Star Trek with Dr. Spock. So we have the title and a character, and then we have the semicolon to introduce a new title and character. Battlestar Galactica with Cylon Raiders, semicolon, and Star Wars with Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, and Darth Vader. So this is another way in which you could use a semicolon, but commas would be fine as well. All right. Now moving on to colons. As a colon is when you join an independent clause with a directly related phrase. So this is actually something that I learned recently, is that the information before the colon must be an independent clause. The professor's actions were within the guidelines of the department policy, full thought, and then colon, they were justified, lawful, and proper. And you can decide whether you want to do lowercase or capital letters after that colon. You'll think of colon as the word thus as a substitute for that. So you can ask yourself, could I put that information in there too? And you can also use it as, we have a list here. You can also use colons to introduce a list. Puppy therapy is useful for various groups. Again, that is an independent clause. And then with the semicolon or with the colon, thus college students, sick children, and the elderly. Or for example, college students, sick children, and the elderly. So that's how we would use colons. So like I said, I just learned it's got to be independent clause before the colon. Any questions on those? Awesome. Okay. And then M and ndash. So we get a lot of questions about these. I personally don't use the ndash in my writing. It's a stylistic choice. So an ndash is, I'm not sure if you can see the difference between these two punctuation marks. It's very subtle. But an ndash is longer than a hyphen, and it's used kind of like a comma to offset information, or it could be used like parentheses. And this is just a stylistic choice. So it's not required. You can use commas instead. I personally use commas instead, but M- is an option. I know a lot of people that are in literature like to use it. Just kind of gives your readers a little different thing to look at. So yeah, the example we have here is, on our vacation, dash, which was long overdue, dash, we visited 3 different countries. So you could substitute that punctuation for a comma or parentheses, and it would have the same meaning. And then the dash is just a little bit longer than a hyphen, and it signifies a range. I work 315 to 1015, page 231 to 245. Sometimes Microsoft Word will just automatically put those in here, but a hyphen is fine. So I'm sure if you ever have questions about what those are, if you've ever heard these terms, I just wanted to go over those real quick. Any questions? Okay. And then the last thing is quotation marks. So you always want to put your periods and your commas inside quotation marks. So as we can see here, I'm sorry. You want to put it inside if the quote is this person is talking about. So this is a stick up comma, said the robber. So the comma is within the quotation marks because that is what the robber said. You see in the next one, the bank robber said, comma, this is a stick up, but the period is in the quotation marks as well. So generally periods and commas go inside the quotation marks, but colons and semicolons go outside the quotation marks unless it's within the text itself. So if there's a semicolon in the quoted text, you're going to leave those obviously within the quotation marks. But here, this is the quotation, I'm sorry, the semicolon is used to introduce a new independent clause, so it's going to go outside the quotation marks. The same generally goes for question marks too. If you're using a quote to ask a question, but the quote itself is not a question, that question mark is going to go outside of the quotation marks. And at the Writing Center, if you want a refresher on these in our in-text citations for MLA and APA on our handout, we have a little box guide to remind everybody how to quote when those other punctuation marks come into play outside of periods and commas. All right, any questions? I know I kind of went fast. We're going to do a little practice together. Use present tense, past tense, and results. Okay, so for the present tense and past tense and results, I don't think there's a general rule of thumb. It just depends on, like I said, it's just context. So it's hard for me to say. When you have to look at your tense basically on what period of time you're talking about. If you're talking about general results, I think what I had, we can go back to my first slide in just a minute and review that at the end after we do some practice. But it's all dependent on what period of time you're talking about and what tense you're going to use. For the semicolon, you don't have to use a semicolon if you don't want to. It's totally fine to just use a period. It's just another piece of punctuation that you can use. Sometimes people like to use them because it feels like you're giving your reader a little bit of a pause, but you're showing that the following sentence is still closely related to the next sentence. But again, it's a stylistic choice. I hardly ever use semicolons in my writing. I think the only time I ever use them is if I'm using those words like however, nevertheless, and I'm connecting using those sort of adjectives. I don't use semicolons normally, so it's a choice. Okay, so let's practice a little bit together. If you guys want to, use your mics to shout out the answer, if you want to just put it in the chat. First, we're going to practice a little bit subject-verb agreement. So let's take a look at these. So the first sentence is, the review of the major works in the respective field were time-consuming. So is there anything wrong with this sentence? And if so, what can we do to fix it? I guess first we should identify what is the subject of this sentence. The review, right? So the review was time consuming. So if you're ever not sure, you can take out these, oops, sorry guys. You can take out the phrasing in between so you can match up a subject with the verb. The review was time consuming. All right, what about number 2? The relevant articles in the field was examined to complete the literature review, to conduct the literature review. Right, so articles is the subject, so we're going to change the verb to were. The articles were examined. All right, and let's take a look at the last one. The results of the initial analysis was to continue working while attempting to correct known problems. Right, the results. So the results is the subject and the results were to continue. All right, awesome. So let's look at sentence fragments. We place the participants in 2 groups, a control group and an experimental group, which was essential in order to measure the results of our intervention. So we have a fragment here. How can we connect these 2 sentences to avoid the fragment? Right. Thank you. Replace the period after group with a comma. Exactly. All right, the research covered various aspects of energy, for example, solar, wind, and water. How can we fix this? Yeah, so we can put a colon, right? And we can also put a comma. Because if you look at it, for example, solar, wind, and water is not a complete thought. It can't stand on its own, so we need to connect it. You can also just get rid of the for example and just change it with a colon. All right, now let's look a little bit at punctuation. The results of the hypothesis were surprising. They disproved our hypothesis entirely. So how can we fix this comma splice? All right, lots of answers, and they are all right. So you can add a coordinating conjunction, comma, but they disproved. You can add a period, or you can add a semicolon. It's up to you. The coordinating conjunction, this is just how I related the 2 ideas. But again, whatever coordinating conjunction you use is going to show the relationship between the 2 ideas. All right, what about this next one? The students wanted to keep refining the methods, but the professor wanted them to move on to other matters. Yes, all we need is a comma. Okay, award-winning films and their directors include The Hurt Locker, directed by Catherine Bigelow, No Country for Old Men, directed by Joel and Ethan Coen, and Life of Pi, directed by Ang Lee. Do we need to change anything? Okay, so yeah, we can leave it as is. Like I said before, the semicolons are completely optional. So it still makes sense with these commas, but as you can see, adding the semicolons is a stylistic choice, but I think it adds more clarity. All right.
Question, do we
Sure.
really need the comma in front of the directed since the movie name's already italicized?
I'm just trying to think if there's one. I feel like I would put that. It just depends on the context of the sentence, but if you want to offset that information, you would have that comma in there. If it was if I flipped it, like Catherine Bigelow directed the Hurt Locker, there wouldn't be a comma. I think it's just to offset the information the way that it's presented. Okay. I think this is the last one. So Smith and Jones and Swenson and Harmon both studied this effect. They found it to be pervasive among high school students, while Swenson and Harmon found it to be most pervasive among that population as well as middle school. So who is the they referring to in this sentence? Smith and Jones, yes, but initially we don't know that, right? The previous sentence has two examples as two groups, so it's not immediately clear. So like I said before, you want to introduce that information. You want to use the proper nouns, not the pronouns, to start things off, especially when there's two different groups that it could be referring to. Okay. All right. And that's it. I just want to plug the Writing Center real quick. I just want to emphasize a little thing is that at the Writing Center, when you guys come, our main concern is with global issues, with intelligibility. We want to make sure that everything is sounding right. So grammar is going to be one of our lower order concerns. We can absolutely help you with your grammar and punctuation and any of those things that you want help with. But first, we want to work on ideas and intelligibility first. So we don't proofread, we don't edit, but we do work with you to help you gain the skills that you need to do that proofreading and editing on your own. We are closed this week, but we will reopen on the 19th. And if you have any questions, or even if you have a quick question about writing or anything, you can email us in the meantime. Although our consultants aren't there, Erin and I are there, so we'd be happy to help you. And we also have a ton of resources on our website, which I'll put in the chat as well. So if you want to brush up on any grammar or any formatting information, we have a ton of handouts that you can refer to for any of this information as well. Right. Any questions for me?
Sarah, I guess my question is more in regards to, English is my second language, and I actually learned English when I was 15. So I feel there's some things that even if I wanted to capture in my writing, I'm just gonna, make those mistakes.
Of course.
But I wonder if you have anything that you recommend that maybe for someone who learn a second language would be better to maybe look at something as a specific on the writing, and any tips that might be helpful.
I think it's just, we all have our strengths and weaknesses. Something that I would recommend, not having seen, your particular writing in general, but I would recommend to everybody, especially people who are non-native speakers, is to, as you proofread and as you edit your paper, I would recommend reading out loud, because it helps to not only see what your mistakes might be, but you also hear it. And I think that that's why we use that technique a lot in the Writing Center is you usually can catch any sort of errors that you make when you vocalize them. And it's especially true for the people that come in who are multilingual writers and who English isn't their native language. I think that that's a strong strategy to use as you go through. And then, like I said, come to the Writing Center, we can look at your paper, we can kind of teach you how to fix some of those patterns of error that you have as well. I hope that was helpful.
No, that is helpful. Uh, I have, I do have someone that I trust to see my. I think the biggest issue with me is that sometimes you go, let's say, to the writing center, right? And this in, I don't want to say this in the wrong way, but I think it's like you're supposed to know this. It's kind of like the attitude, but I, and I don't mean the UNLV, but I have used. And I think, again, going back to this, English being the second language, I think there's some things I just feel like I just didn't know that,
Yeah, and that's fine. I mean, even as native speakers, like most of the stuff in this presentation, like I learned by teaching. We don't know all these rules. I've made all these errors. I was always told to use a comma when I needed to take a breath, or when there was like a pause, or when it felt natural to take a pause, and that rule isn't true. Like there are those sort of guidelines. So I would hope, like, at our writing center, nobody would ever make you feel bad for not knowing anything. Like, we're all learning, we're all learners. So just, take heart in knowing that, and, don't feel bad. Like, we're all still, this isn't innate, especially in English. Unlike other places, other countries, we don't necessarily learn all these grammar rules directly. It's all kind of indirectly absorbed. So, I don't know. I just want you to feel better, like take heart in knowing that we all make tons of these mistakes.
I have learned that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. And I hope you come to the writing center. We'll love to help you. I have, let's see, another question. Is there a rule of thumb for the length of a sentence or a paragraph in publications? Again, it's all specific to the publication. I think, Nev, there's another workshop, right, about publishing?
Yeah, at the end of the week, we'll have a how to publish your thesis and dissertation workshop.
Okay. And as far as avoiding I or we, again, it just depends on the context of what you're writing. So, just if you're doing a article, or you want to explore like what you did as a researcher, I think you can use I or we, but again, it just depends on the context, on the subject. I can tell you, in some of the basic writing that we get and lower levels, we tend to tell people to avoid using the first person or even the second person you, but I think it's all subject and assignment specific, so I can't really say. Let's see. All right, any other questions?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you.